Thank you very much, and I thank the Foundation and all of the sponsors of this very timely conference. I apologize for not speaking to you in Portuguese. I can only assume the organizers made a tactical decision that I should speak after lunch so that if you put on your earphones and turn down the sound, you can sleep. Someone asked me yesterday if I was here representing the views of the United States, and I can tell you that I am not, that in my last position as the chairman of the Development Assistance Committee, I represented the views of 24, now 27 nations, including Portugal. And what that meant for me was that whatever Ana Paula Fernandes told me to say, I would say it, as she was the vice chair of the Development Assistance Committee, and you should feel very privileged that she represents Portugal on that committee. Let's talk a little bit about development and what's going on internationally now with respect to the goal of producing new development goals for the post-2015 period. I think the Ebola crisis has reminded us all of the vulnerability of people who live in the developing world, and certainly it also has exposed our own vulnerability to infectious disease. It may seem to a lot of you that living in this world is like living in Armageddon. We have wars in the Middle East, we have terrorism, we have natural disasters, and then we have disease and climate change. All of these things affect people across borders. It's somewhat sad that a disease like Ebola, which takes so many lives in such a short period of time, receives so much attention from the press, whereas the incremental deaths of even children over a year period, some 22,000 children who die because of poverty, receives very little attention. And I suspect that that's why it's so important that as we consider the new development goals that we think about the issue of political saliency. In other words, what is the political impact? How do we understand the vulnerability that we have and that people who live in the developing world have as we contemplate the goals for the international community? We shouldn't be surprised by the fact that we're living in a troubled world. If you think about the growth of population on this globe since the United Nations system was created in 1945, we had 2 billion people at that time. We now have 7.2 billion people, and we're heading toward 9 before we might level off by the year 2050. The institutions that manage this population are clearly underfunded, outmoded in many cases, and not very innovative. And we can only hope that technology and science, along the lines of what Alfredo was saying, may move onto the scene and compensate for this institutional lag. Let me talk a little bit about the effort that the United Nations is undertaking now to create these new goals. I was very privileged to participate as a high-level member of the Development Assistance Committee in the 1990s in the development of the Millennium Development Goals. The first iteration came out of the Development Assistance Committee. In fact, I should lack humility by saying that the French development minister who has written an article says that I was the father of the MDGs. Now, I appreciated that exaggeration, and everyone, of course, wants to be affiliated with something that's been relatively successful. It did create political saliency. It did create a political will to increase resources for official development assistance by 50%. It did indeed have an impact on the elimination of 50% of extreme poverty. And we made progress on those 8 goals, even if we did not reach all of the targets. If you think about the effort we made over a 2-year period within the Development Assistance Committee, just donors, while we consulted with others, it was mainly donors. And we came up with a report that was later endorsed by the G8. And when Kofi Annan was looking for something to drop into the Millennium Declaration, this was available. And there was very little debate about it. Today we have a multiplicity of efforts underway to come up with new goals. We had, the Secretary General had created a new high-level panel, which was chaired by the UK, the Indonesian President, the UK Prime Minister, and the President of Liberia. It was a very, very effective panel, and they came out with a report that I hope informs the process. It may be the high level, it may be the high watermark for this process. 60 UN agencies formed a task force to, again, inform the process and to advise the Secretary General. And then there is an open working group, which seems to have the highest standing, the most legitimacy, that evolved from the Rio +20 conference in 2007. And that group has consulted with regional groups all over the world. It's clearly been very effective in its openness. It's a very transparent operation. Now let me talk a little bit about where we are. The MDGs had 8 goals and about 13 targets. And what evolved from targets are indicators to see whether or not you've actually reached the targets and reached the higher level goals. The high level panel, the one I mentioned that was chaired by the 3 heads of government, posed 12 goals and 49 targets. And the open working group, which again is the group that seems to have the most standing now, has created 17 goals and 126 targets. And you can imagine the number of indicators that would flow from that, thousands probably. I worry a bit about this because obviously the UN agencies, people in the academic community have taken over this process to a very large extent. And what it will require, of course, is good data, good statistics on whether or not, in fact, we're reaching these goals. The other iteration that's extremely important is the fact that these goals will be applied at the national, at the global, at the national, and at the local level. In other words, the people who are involved in the development process will have a say about the priorities. And I think that's a very important iteration of this process, because basically the principle that was established was called the Paris Principles and the Busan Principles of local ownership is extremely important, as we know, in development work. The question then is, how does one aggregate goals and determine whether or not, in fact, we're making progress? If most of these goals go from the period of 2015 to 2030, we're going to need a central body that will be able to analyze and aggregate these goals and determine whether progress is being made. But I return to my original point. Are we going to be able to achieve the same degree of political saliency that will enable the political leaders of this world to respond and provide the resources and the support necessary to actually accomplish something? It's easy enough to achieve a consensus by giving everybody what they want. And it seems to me that every group that has an interest in an aspect of development has weighed in heavily in terms of the open working group. But what will be achieved? Will this process achieve the same political impact as did the MDGs? I think that's a very ambitious goal, but if you consider the problems that the world faces it's almost a bottom line goal that we achieve at least as much as we did under the MDGs. I have some recommendations. I don't get a chance to talk to audiences that often except my class at the University of Minnesota, and not very many of them can take action. I've been very impressed this morning to hear from some of your former leaders and leaders in Portugal and from around the Portuguese-speaking community. And don't underestimate your impact. If you took all of the Portuguese-speaking countries in this world, you have a pretty high percentage of the world population. So never underestimate the role that you can play in this process. Portugal, Brazil alone, if you consider two donors, one new provider of assistance in Brazil, and Portugal, one of the original members of the Development Assistance Committee. It's a tremendous role. So therefore, I make the presumption of offering some suggestions. The first one would be that take these 17 goals and group them according to sectors, if you will, but group them with the idea that they have to be politically salient. In other words, if we propose 17 goals, you should have something like a chapeau that is a political statement that talks about the urgency of meeting these broad goals in global terms. Second, focus on the need to create country systems that can measure results and aggregate to show the global impact. There is nothing that is more important in development right now than to develop these country systems. In Busan, the development community writ large that included the development partners, the donors, civil society, and the private sector basically agreed that we should measure results in a way that would enable the developing partners to actually own the process. And we need now, basically what we said was that it should be the default position. If a donor cannot trust the country systems to handle the resources, then there's an obligation to help that country to improve the system. So I think we have not paid enough attention to that, and we need to pay more. The third position I would take would be to set goals for new development financing that combines ODA. Have I already spoken for 10 minutes? Yeah. Boy, it's amazing how I've been overcome by my logic. I have more to say. I'll just take a few more minutes. Set goals for new development financing that combines ODA with all of the other sources in a very intelligent way, and we'll hear more about that later. 4, vastly increase ODA, including ODA from this country and every country. I note the proposal that is being made in Lima at the climate change negotiation that there would be a green climate fund created at $9.3 billion. I also would note that we did a study a few years ago showing that out of the overall ODA amount, $20 billion is being invested in adaptation and mitigation of climate change. That money should be, if it's in a separate fund, but it should be spent with development in mind. And then finally, use the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation to actually implement these ideas and to measure, and so that we hold the international community accountable. That's where the development professionals sit. It's not the politicians that decide these goals at the United Nations. It's the people that participate in this new global partnership, which was decided at Busan. What it needs, however, is UN endorsement. It needs to be sanctioned by the United Nations. The secretariat for it is the UNDP and the OECD DAC. But it seems to me that there is a need for a central body that will oversee this. I have much more to say about inequality, and I hope, therefore, someone will ask me a question about it from the audience, and I won't abuse the audience and the chairman in particular by speaking any longer. Thank you.